Welcome everyone. Today is December 19th, 3 o'clock, and we are at the Filmmakers Co-op, New American Cinema, in the middle of Manhattan, in the middle of an outbreak of COVID. But this is a celebration of cinema, and we are gathered here together to honor and celebrate the first filmmaker I saw talk about his work. My name's F.M.C. I'm a filmmaker, executive director, and this is Larry Gottheim. And I saw Larry Gottheim in Hawaii. What year was that, Larry?
I have no idea. I was trying to think of it.
And I think it was in 1980 or before you were all born, like 78. And it was the first time I saw an experimental filmmaker. And Lynn Sachs was also at that screening. And we're a collection of experimental avant-garde artists, video makers, performers, musicians, and we're going to celebrate our 60th anniversary. And this is a celebration of Larry Gottheim. And Larry, will you talk a little bit?
I'm going to be talking for days.
Oh my, all right. I'm going to put my mask on and sit down. We have a great website, www.film-makerscoop.com. And this is Larry Gottheim. The legendary Larry Gottheim.
Well, this is a very
Did I cover it all?
important thing for me. And hope it will be for you. But I've written a book about my work that's made me review everything from the point of view of somebody who's watching you, so that there's a kind of balance between what I could talk about in making it and what now, many years later, looking at the film, I'm a different person, and I see a lot of things in there that are there, but I wasn't kind of sort of consciously aware of them before. So I went through that whole process of writing the book and revising it, and I'm still doing that. But meanwhile, this is an advance over that, is that once I knew that this was going to happen, or wanted to happen, I've been constantly thinking about this film. And so I want to sort of inaugurate a post-book discussion of my film, and I hope that it will lead you not just into like something about the film, but first of all about all my work, which I now think of as one work, but also about cinema, about art, about philosophy, psychology, whatever is in there. The book is actually called The Red Thread, and it has a lot of meanings, but it's sort of the threads that run through the books, through the films that might seem very different, the threads that go out into the world, into life, into your experience and your life as someone experiencing the film. So it's wonderful, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. I should say one thing about it, is that, which is very important, is that there seems to be an ending of the film, and on the original 60-minute film is a long period of black, and then suddenly the material that you see at the very beginning, which you've probably forgotten about, comes back, and after that it's the end of the film. So when you think it's the end of the film, please just stay with it, and you'll see the real end. If we need to take a break, what I would like very much is if you could still be within the ambience of having just experienced the film, and you're still kind of, whatever, have it in your memory now, so that I could begin in that kind of same atmosphere, rather than, I'm sure you all can do that automatically anyway, but rather than just sort of break up and then have to come back again. Okay, and then after I finish talking, which will probably be on Thursday afternoon, I'll be happy to have questions and hear from you. Okay, so let's just watch the film.
And this is Ian Adams, and Ian Adams is going to do the Q&A and projection. And he's works at the co-op, and he's organizing this amazing event.
Perfect, let's watch the movie.
Thank you.
My students used to complain, some of them, that I would go talking around in circles. But I always come back, and that's something about me. And there's some other things about me here that I'll talk about. Anyway, the film goes around in circles. So I want to sort of approach it like that. I'm sorry that these stupid titles are on here, because later on I had films where I made titles for the film, but in a lot of my early work, including this, there's no printed title on the film, because initially I felt that film was a visual medium, and I had inhibitions about language and sound, which work out in these films. But I want to talk a little bit about the title of the film, which is, the title, of course, is not like the cover of a book. It's not like something about the film, but like a book, if you if you have another edition of the book with a different cover, it's still the same book. So that the title is actually part of the experience of the film. And it could be unconscious, like what's it going to show, Tree of Knowledge, and you don't even think about it, or you could think about it. If you see the film again, which I hope you will, then you'll think about it more. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Tree of Knowledge. It was the beginning of my, as a kid, of my philosophy, interest in philosophy. I didn't know what philosophy was, but the thing about the Genesis story, as I understood it as a kid, was very, very profound. So I want to talk about it a little bit. Also, I can't get into that, but when it says the elective affinities, part 4, that also is a very important part. And the title, Elective Affinities, for this series of films is a lot of implications that I keep finding more and more. I actually thought of this title very casually, like a lot of the things in my films, including this film, came almost like intuitively. Yeah, okay. So there was an apple tree. Somehow that seemed, okay, I'll call it the Tree of Knowledge. But now I think about the Tree of Knowledge. My father's mother, had in their house in Brooklyn, they had a room in front. It was like an enclosed thing looking out into the street. And they had some books, like Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and they had this like children's encyclopedia called the Book of Knowledge, which I used to like read a lot. It was like in many volumes. They also had a piano in there that when the adults were talking in the kitchen, I would be like making these, what to me were like musical events by just pounding on the piano. But the Tree of Knowledge. So God created the world according to this founding myth of so much of Western thought and Middle Eastern thought. And he created all the trees and all the animals and all everything. And then he got tired, so he took a day off. And somewhere in there, he created a man, Adam. And he created a woman, Eve, out of the bone of the man. Why was that? The only thing I could think of now is that because another human being couldn't be created out of a womb, out of a uterus, out of a vagina, because there wasn't anything like that, so it had to be created out of something from his own body. So he created Eve, and Adam and Eve were in the garden happily together with all the animals that were friendly to each other, and they were naked. I think of these, a whole series of paintings by Cranach the Elder, you know, of Adam and Eve in the garden, like naked with a tree in the middle, and they would have, like in one of them, there's the lion and the lamb on either side that are, whatever. Anyway, then he created a garden, the Garden of Eden, for them to be in the middle of it. And in the Garden of Eden, there were two trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. The tree of life is too complicated for me to really even begin to grasp anything about it. So I just want to talk about the tree of knowledge. But he said for both of these, this is the one where you can do anything you want, but don't eat these, don't taste the apples from these trees. So the snake, which at that time had legs, little legs, like I think about the Chinese dragon in Chinatown in New Year's, you know, with, it was more like that kind of dragon. Anyway, that snake kind of seduced Eve or convinced her, why don't you try it, whatever. It's interesting, in this great work about Genesis by Milton called Paradise Lost, which I had to read. It's like an incredible thing. I had this big fat book with the text on top, and then half of the page was footnotes. And you had to sort of plow through this thing, but it was really totally great, wow. And the major personage there was Satan, and it's really like, in a way, about Satan. Well, in the Genesis thing, Satan doesn't exist, it's the snake who does that. Anyway, by eating this apple, tasting this apple, they acquired, to me, they acquired knowledge. In some things, and I'm not a biblical scholar, the knowledge of good and evil. I don't know, I don't believe it. But anyway, they acquired what to me was knowledge. And knowledge is, of course, the main question of Western philosophy from pre-Plato and Socrates, through Plato and Socrates, through the whole history of Western philosophy, including now postmodern philosophy, is the question of what is knowledge. So you can begin to see how that has something to do with the film in some kind of strange way. But the other thing about Adam and Eve, after eating the thing, is that they became ashamed of their nakedness. And so they covered themselves. And that was really, you know, as a kid, or even now, you know, wow, why was that so important? And it's kind of interesting because I think covering suggests the erotic attraction when you're uncovered. In other words, nudity, male, female, gender, nudity, or even male, whatever, is sexually attractive. It wasn't sexually attractive when they were naked, but when they're covered, then their bodies became objects of desire, and that led to them bearing children. So as opposed to Adam being created now, children were created from women. And one of the punishments that God said on Eve was that babies would be born now with painful birth, or some kind of pain, which was, you know, again, sort of curious because there wasn't anybody before them. But anyway, there is a kind of, even knowledge, I wondered about that term where as a kid, we were like fascinated by these words, so that they would say, like it was basically male and woman. I said, in Shakespeare, he knew her. Knew her means he fucked her. And it was male to female. Women didn't say that about men. I knew him. Somehow, anyway, that is in the language somehow. So I leave that for like later, but I wondered, what about that part that's implied by the title? So now, since the film is constructed as in this kind of circular way, I'd like to approach it that way, so that the first thing and the last thing are strange. Even to me, they're strange. They came about because when I had finished the film without them, I felt it's too finality. I mean, this whole thing about the garden of its clothes, blood goes to black, that was too final, and I wanted to have something else. So originally I thought of it as what would come at the end of the film. And it came, usually in my films, I never filmed very much. It was always sort of very important if I was touching the camera, turning on the camera. That was so serious. I didn't, like now people make like hours and hours of stuff on the cell phones. I don't know what's going to happen to that stuff. For me, I made very little. And also I had saved material, like not a lot, but especially when I was teaching in the basement where the film department production facilities were, there was also the center for where all the films that were shown in classes, like anthropology classes, science classes, whatever, they would be stored there. So going into my class, sort of winging it in every class, I would sort of go in there, look at the titles, and pick out titles, and then show them in class. It was always to me, very revealing and very important. Like whatever the film was, there were always so many lessons to learn from it. So I had some films, one of them was this Paranoid Condition film, and there were some other films that I had, just a little collection of maybe 8 films that I had kept without knowing what I would use them for. They were just there. And so sometimes I would think, oh, I have that material. Okay, so I had made this footage of Debbie, my wife, who had a very, very major role in all of the films, starting from the very first one, Blues, through all the films. This is her last appearance in one of my films. And she's there looking at the college photographs of her father. Now, I know I have a lot of personal connections with all of that stuff, like her father, everything, but I don't expect an audience to know or even care about that, but it has to do with sort of the feeling of pressure behind it. And what she's doing in some way is editing. I mean, as opposed to now, you can digital, if you want to, your stuff there. If you have the photographs, you have to put them, if you wanted to organize them, in an album and put them in there with these corners. And that's what she's doing. She's editing the images of her father, mostly in his like athletic clothes. So that was one of the elements that existed as something that I filmed without knowing anything that I was going to do with it. Let me tell you a little circular thing about the other element here. Is previously, a few years before, I had been invited to have a screening in the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh. Warhol was very important to me, especially the early films of Warhol, like Kiss and Eat and Empire and so on. But I continued for a while to be very affected by his films when they no longer were ones that were particularly influential to me. There was a film called Four Stars, or Iron Man, and Chelsea Girls was a very, very powerful experience for me. I remember seeing it at the same time that I saw Shirley Clarke's Portrait of Jason, which also had a powerful effect on me. And I invited Shirley Clarke to come to Binghamton when I was still in the English department. She was the first sort of visitor, and she came with a suitcase full of films from the co-op. By an amazing, one of these wonderful links is that my films are archived in this Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research, and her films are in there as well. Anyway, Sally Reynolds, I think maybe that's her name, she was very important to me because Brakhage had recently made this series of 3 films, Deus Ex and so on, known as the Pittsburgh trilogy, and he would come to Binghamton and show them, and they were, of course, very important experiences. His whole connection with coming to Binghamton and so on was very important. And she was even famous. She was something to do with the Carnegie Institute, and she had set up this whole thing for Brakhage to make those films in Pittsburgh. So there I was, arriving in Pittsburgh, and I stayed at her place, and she said, did I know that Ondine had moved to Pittsburgh? And I thought, wow, because in Chelsea Girls, in those films of Warhol's, there's always a sense of coming to the ending. I mean, there's a certain kind of structure to them, which is not always the case. But so Ondine becomes the sort of powerful presence that that comes near the end, that comes near the end of the film. So I said, well, and of course Warhol was from Pittsburgh, so maybe that's why he moved there. Anyway, I said, well, I would like to meet him. So she said, okay, well, here's his contact information. So I called him, and on my last day there, I went to visit. And he was with his partner then, Roger Jacoby. And we all hit it off. It was really a very great thing, and a lot of it was centered on music and so on. Anyway, then I had a flight that evening, and Roger was very slow driver. So I'm talking in the car, driving slowly, so I missed the plane. So I had to stay over. And the main thing that I remember from that night was them playing all these records of Maria Callas records, and sort of trying to express their love and what was so important to them about this music. We became friends, and I actually invited Ondine and Roger to come to Binghamton, and he had a print of Chelsea Girls, which he showed in Binghamton, and then he started a little tour with that print. Okay, now, a couple of years later, I had another screening at the Carnegie Institute, and Robert Haller was the head of the Pittsburgh filmmakers, and he said, I guess as Sally Reynolds had said to Brakhage, if you need any equipment, if you want to do anything while you're here, so you could borrow equipment. I said, well, actually, I'd like to borrow if you have a Nagra and a microphone. So I had the use of this Nagra and microphone, and I went to visit Roger. Ondine had died of AIDS before that, so he was with, anyway, so I was trying to think what to do. So there were 2 important things that came out of that. One was, for some reason, I thought of when I was a kid and my mother would take me to these department stores, and she would be looking at dresses. And I would be playing, running around, hiding underneath the rack of the dresses. And the women would, hastily slide the dresses over. And I remembered that sound. And I thought, that's what I want to record. Can you help me do that? He said, sure, we can go to this big department store in Pittsburgh, and you could try to do that. So we went to the department store. I went underneath the thing with the Nagra, and he was sliding the things, and it wasn't working. The quality of the sound wasn't what I wanted. So I never actually recorded it. But meanwhile, this sales lady came over. She was curious, and she started to talk to us. And then she took out her wallet, and she was showing us these pictures of her, where she lived, and so on. And so I recorded that. And that's the sound that you hear in that opening and closing section. Now, I've got to tell you that I completely love it. I mean, of course I love everything, but I really love it. It's so incredibly beautiful, and it's so connected. Everything that she says seems to be as though it was written as a text for my films. I mean, the doctor lived next door, the trees coming from, and there's something sort of beautiful and pathetic about her, is that she is, first of all, she's fully realized. This film has a number of characters, and she is the first one, and to me she's very fully realized as a person in terms of what she says. And this thing about the doctor, well, this is the way of the kitchen, everything that she says seems to be almost like poetry or a text. This thing about the trees, that she went all the way to Musters, Indiana, and they were little, and now they're touching the wires. That's so incredibly both relevant to my films from Fog Line and so on. But it's also a kind of diminution of nature. I mean, what can I say? The nature in my early films, like Horizon, I mean, they were always put in these categories of nature films, which always sort of bothered me in a certain way. But she wants to have some kind of sense of nature in her little house on the street with other houses, so she goes and buys these little trees that she could plant in front or back of her house, and she's very proud of them. And so there's something sort of sad about her as a representation of a certain aspect of life that appears in several different places in the films. So anyway, that's one element in that, well, in the film. Another thing with Roger, he was now in another relationship with somebody who was deaf. And so he was going to this deaf bar, which it was a hangout for like a lot of deaf people in Pittsburgh. So I had the Nagra, and I just turned it on, and so recorded a bunch of sound there. And that's the sound that we hear in this opening and closing section. And again, it seems that it's almost like scripted to be for one of the films. The first thing that we hear is, you have pictures of naked man and woman. I mean, of course, that had to be the opening thing with this film, Tree of Knowledge. But the other things are more mysterious. Farnsworth, shut up. And then this clanging of a pinball machine and of coins rolling on a table. I'm always interested in the pinball machine in the French films, like Godard films and other films. It seems that more than in the United States, like bars, well, they were in bars also here, but it appeared, there were often scenes in bars or restaurants where in the background somebody is playing the pinball machine. And it sort of struck me as interesting, must have struck them too. So that's in there. Okay, so what I want to say about that whole section is that it was meant to be the last section, but then I put it also as the first section, so that it's something, I don't quite understand it. I mean, in the way that I understand the other elements in the film. I mean, and also, there's not an invariant element. By invariant, I mean that having selected the documentary film Paranoid Condition, I accepted it totally. I'll tell you about one little thing, but basically every frame is there just as it is. It's just that it's cut in half and it's put in a different order. Now, in a lot of my films, including in my last film, Not, there's an element that is the invariant element. In the first sound film in Elective Affinities, Mouche Volante, there's an interview with the wife of blind Willie Johnson. And of course, blindness is in some way like deafness. It fascinated me in a certain way. Also, deaf people vocalize, and their vocalization sounds sometimes almost like animal sounds, which interested me. In the previous film to this, Four Shadows, there's one segment of material that's with these apes, which have a way of vocalizing in a double way with their mouths, and then they have this sac under their thing that we can also make these sounds, so that sometimes also in this first section you hear that kind of this kind of laughter, which it's a kind of language, it's a translation of language. I mean, so this gets into a kind of a philosophical thing, because they're trying to say something, and so they're usually saying that accompanied by the sign language, but that's a kind of vocalization. And I see, even on TV, where you see this person doing the song, they're mouthing, they're not making sounds, but they're mouthing while they're doing that. Okay, so when I first thought of it, it was like moving into the future. It was like the film ends, the garden closed, and now it's going off in some kind of direction in which the two elements are not, neither of them is invariant. In other words, I could edit the sound material and the image material so that they made sense and that they had some kind of relationship to each other. Here, the relationship, as far as I could see, is not meaningful. In other words, it's not that underneath there's a kind of affinity. This gets into what elective affinities is, so that in the body of the film, where there's this wild tree footage and then this documentary, there is established an affinity between them that's more than just the coincidence of this gesture has this sound. But by putting it first, it makes the end both going into the future and also going back to the beginning. In other words, we are moving towards some unknown future, but also we're going back to the beginning, which is a very important thing in this film and in a number of other films of mine. It has to do with the circularity. I say in the beginning that one of the things that is Ouroboros. Ouroboros was the god in, I don't know, Indian thing where the snake is biting its own tail. And so the form of the film has that sense of it can be going around in a circle because it comes back to the beginning at the end and so on. And of course there's the snake in there somehow. Okay, so that's the opening thing. Now we come to the next inner circle is this tree material, which I think I filmed. I can't even remember exactly how I did it, but I actually filmed it twice, like with the aperture. I was like controlling the aperture. So at first it starts from whiteness or blackness towards white, and at the end it goes from whiteness towards black. Now this slow passage of stuff is also something that's important. I don't know if any of you know this first film of Blues, where there's a bowl of blueberries that you see, and basically in the beginning you see the whole bowl full of blueberries, and slowly through the film the blueberries are removed, and at the end you have this whiteness which merges with the lightness of the film. So it's a kind of slow thing. In Fog Line, again, as I see it, especially now from this film, the trees are really what's well, every element in it is important, but the trees are really, in a way, have a kind of centrality about it. And so what happens is that the fog is lifting. So during the course of the film, the fog lifts. So in the beginning, it's almost like what happens here. You start to see this amorphous shape, and then it becomes gradually clearer to be a film. Now, the thing about that, to me, now, thinking about Fog Line, is that the trees have, they remain there. They're like, there they are. They're unchanging. The world is changing around them. The fog is lifting. And so we see them a little bit more clearly, but they are the same. They are just standing there. And I thought of the term manifesting. I first thought of that in the previous film, Four Shadows, where that section with the apes vocalizing, it's a family of apes that are in a zoo. And the zoo is a place where they're looked at. They're objects of you hear the kids looking, everybody's looking, I'm looking with the camera, and they are, doing their, and they have like artificial trees in there so that they can, play or climb up, do stuff in there. So it's a lot of, I'd like to do this, what I'm doing now, at another time with Four Shadows and get into it. But there were times when one of the apes, they're like moving, just stands there as though he has the consciousness of being on view, and he's manifest, there I am, the something that I am manifesting. So I think of the trees there as doing that. Okay, now to get into the more heart of the film is that, first of all, there's a psychological thing which you could probably pick up on a little from your own experience, and that of your family, of your friends, of yourself, of what we could call mental illness or something that's not quite right, or to really serious stuff like suicide and so on. But everybody has in their family. I certainly did, and actually still do. So what happened was that the passivity in my early films is really essential. I mean, Fog Line, all those films have to be what they are, partly because the camera is either static, or if it's moving by a car or by in doorway, it's moving by a slight move. It's not moving by a kind of desire to move. And I began to feel that even though this was how the films came into existence, and I'm thankful that it did, it represented something in my own passivity, which had to do with feelings about my father. This is outside of what your experience of the film would be, but actually with somebody, Jim Jennings, actually a filmmaker that said something talking, and he said, why don't you move the camera? It's like fun. And one of the issues also that I had about this passivity had to do with Stan Brakhage, because Brakhage was enormously important in his work. Everybody has to deal with it in some way. But also he was able to come to Binghamton, whatever. So he was a kind of presence, like a larger-than-life presence, which he becomes larger and larger in life. But one of the things about him was that the camera and his arm was part of his making of the film, was to the artistry of his own moving the camera in different ways. And I felt that with some of the filmmakers that were, this again gets very complicated, but like Brakhage, Kubelka, whatever, it was important to be influenced by them. Maya Deren, I should say, very important to me, especially later. I wasn't that kind of person. And that had implications for how my work was perceived, is still perceived. But also, I felt that it was sort of like an inhibition, that maybe there was something a little bit, disturbed about that passivity. So I wanted to do something with movement, but I didn't want to do expressive movement. So I decided to do this thing with this tree outside of my house. Brakhage had told me about this film stock that he had discovered called MS film. It was, I think, made for medical filming. But anyway, it was ectochrome, but it rendered color in a more vibrant way, as you could see in the film. But what I wanted to do, I had this feeling that I had to actually overcome an inhibition. And so I said, I'm going to go all the way. I'm going to film it, and I can see through the camera, but I'm not trying to make beautiful camera movements. In fact, I'm making somewhat crazy camera movements, or at least, just erratic camera movements. So I had all of that material, and maybe because of the feeling that I was breaking through my own inhibition, this film that I had put aside of Paranoid Conditions came into play, and I thought, what about editing this wild stuff against the gestures and so on in that film? there's a lot, maybe here I don't have to say so much because it's kind of evident when you see the film, is both the content of what they're saying. I mean, of course there's a simple idea, namely that the very nature of paranoia is thinking that there's a kind of symbolic meaning to everything. And so while they are expressing that, the film is actually observing that, is that every little gesture, you know, somebody goes like this, they go like that, they go like this, whatever. It does have meaning. I mean, it's not necessarily meaning, but it's articulated in the film. So that's one of the things about it. Now, the paranoid film is a documentary. It's like a teaching film. It's meant to be shown in medical school or whatever to teach people what it is. And so this is a kind of, to use a term that nobody understands, even me, a little bit, of deconstruction, of deconstructing that paranoid condition film so it becomes something very different than what its intention was and what it seems to be. And that's where it has something to do with knowledge. It's like an instructional film. It's made to teach something by pointing things out. And it's very confusing because some of the things, like, you can't deny that these people, whatever we think of paranoia is, these people certainly have it in a way. It's not saying, no, they're really perfectly normal, great people, whatever. But on the other hand, there's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with the way that the doctor is presenting them, and that gets up to a deeper and deeper and deeper level. It's not just that he's a jerk or whatever. I mean, he's not really, he's in there too. You know, he's like one of them, which I'll come back to a little bit. But it's as though the nature of documentary and the nature of knowledge, the nature of teaching knowledge is questioned in a certain way. Now I get to what's really at the heart of the film. Is actually with Alan, my friend and former student, was teaching at the University of Oklahoma, and I went to have a screening there, and in the basement of the building there were these piles of film cans of all kinds of things that were shown in classes in the Oklahoma public schools, and now they're basically being thrown out. So I picked out a few, and one of them that was called Seasons of the Year. Of course, I was going to take that one because of horizons and, you know, the presence of the seasons, and also in this footage. I think maybe I didn't even have that footage yet. And I didn't even watch it for a long time. But then when I watched it, it really struck a deep chord because it was the same kind of thing in that it's a teaching film, a documentary film meant to teach people about the nature of the seasons. And on the one hand, of course it's true. I mean, it's not that I don't believe or you don't believe that the sun and the stuff is what really causes the shadows and water. I mean, but in some way, it's also wrong. I mean, here, later on, I became influenced by Nietzsche, especially, who brought up a whole thing in philosophy to question the nature of every single thing that seemed obviously true. Simply like almost like throwing a bomb into the middle of every, so in some way I feel like I am questioning the nature of knowledge or the nature of scientific knowledge. I'm not saying that scientific knowledge is wrong, but what I'm saying is that maybe the real nature of things is being covered over. And here we come to the central characters of the film are Kenneth and Louise, these children in that documentary film who are, they are the instruments of teaching in the film because of course they're demonstrating what the narrator is talking about. But they are in a way that's transparently controlled. I mean, you could see almost like in a couple of the hints that they were standing there and then he said, okay, now go out and touch the tree. And so they go and do that. Or they look down at their feet. Or they're what I thought of them more recently was that they are child zombies. They are, they become instruments of somebody else's direction, just as the audience is. In other words, the very nature of these kinds of films is not only to give you the content of what the film is about, but to continue to form the audience of the children in the classes that would see these films, or the children, or the teachers that would see these films. It's a mode of expressing knowledge which covers up knowledge, to put it in a kind of simple way like that. And so in some way, the emblem of the film is the thing where Kenneth looks up and looks up in the sky, like it says, "Do you know why?" Which echoes one of the things that Hollis Frampton film, I think. Anyway, that's. I mean, I used. In my last film, Not, the invariant element is a musical work by somebody. Anyway, where that is the invariant thing, in which the different sections are edited to that structure of that musical work. And what that work, the woman who wrote it is a Catalan that I met in Barcelona. And so it's in 4 different languages, just as, by the way, my interest in language and the music of language is in the garden is closed, where it's said by a voice through this microphone in these several different languages. But what it is 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. Goes through that in several different languages: Catalan, Spanish, English, and I forget what. Anyway, 4 languages. And I was remembering, I don't think that I know she wasn't thinking about this, but because it's this insistence on counting, I remembered this thing in Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, where he says 2 times 2 is 4 is like a wall, and that a much more free thing is 2 times 2 is 5. that's a more way of freedom. Now, it's not that we don't know that 2 times 2 is 4, but that again, even counting or learning how to count, learning the alphabet, learning anything is part of the inner structuring of what it means to be a human being, but how that thing of us being human beings is molded in certain ways, so that in some sense, however free we may feel we are not completely.
Do you
Oh,
want
but
to
I want to
ask
say one
questions?
thing that's really important is that like music or because music is a really important thing for me as the art form that probably is the most important to me, even though they're all very important. But the experience of music is the pleasurable experience of it. That's really what it is. So an analysis of music is not the same as the music. I mean, it's interesting and it's important, but the purpose of music is not to exist as something to be analyzed, although it's good to analyze it. So I don't want to make this kind of like a philosophy lesson or something, I mean, because the film has its own, your experience of the film is what it really is. Good.
Bravo.
Just
Larry should.
A question?
Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about whether seeing this now, at this time, makes these themes appear any more prescient or different to you. You know, I'm thinking about the kind of epistemological crisis of the Trump era, where, you know, there are alternative facts, and you mentioned deconstruction and postmodernism, that these things have been sort of turned around a little bit to attack the left from the right, interestingly. And so my feelings about a lot of sort of questioning of basic knowledge about, you know, let's say, whether or not you should get a vaccine, you know, these kinds of things, has this double edge to it that this film stirs up, I think.
You want to say something?
What's that?
Do you want to say something?
Well, I'm just asking you, having.
Okay. Well, I do think about that. I mean, especially this whole section, we're talking about religion and Hitler and so on, is very powerful and resonates somewhat beyond the fact that this is a kind of example of paranoia. And I do think about that. Actually, I'm so consumed by this book and dealing with my prints and all that, and making enough to pay the rent and all that. But I really have a burning desire to make something else. But the thing is that some of these films, especially the last two films, they have so much resonance to issues that are not just philosophical, but in the world. And so I was thinking, I can't just make something, I mean, like blues or Fogwell. I mean, that is over for me. And it's important, it lives. But if I was going to make something new, it has to have some kind of resonance beyond what its formal element is. So I think about what you're talking about is, I can't quite think of a way of bringing that kind of material in. But I agree that I feel that there is some kind of way that it has a special meaning now.
Is there any other questions?
Yeah,
Alan,
Yeah.
go for it.
yeah. There's a question in, I guess, 3 parts. It has to do with your book,
Yeah.
right? You said in your introduction earlier that you see your films as one work,
Yes.
and I love that.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true for every artist or every filmmaker?
Well, I've thought of that. I actually think, because I thought about this a lot, and I've thought about that even today. I try to think of filmmakers whose work is more accessible like that, and we're not. I mean, for example, Warhol is an example of not, in a way, is that the implications of those early films, certainly the films where he wasn't even making them anymore, have no connection. So I was trying to think within whatever we call this, personal filmmaking, examples where it would be natural to think of the body of work as one project and where that doesn't quite work. And I'm struggling with that, actually.
I mean, I think it's really an interesting question because, I mean, your book is a psychobio filmography autobio. It's a lot interwoven. So, in order for your work, in order for the entire body of your work to make sense, then because you're doing this at this stage in your life now, so that means somehow you're trying to, and maybe you already have, made sense of your life. I mean, that's in effect what, but the other two parts of my question, let's just think framing it two ways, in time and in space. Time is looking back at your life, at your work, how you went from one work to the next, to the next, to the next, how events in your life, what you read, what you listened to, what your affinities, what your, you know, how that makes sense. But also thinking about spatially, as that's one kind of sense over time. But then there's another kind of thinking about life, say, as a canvas, and an abstract canvas, let's just say, an abstract painting, in which, how should we say, a work that's anomalous or work that's different is that part of the canvas because it has those kind of brushstrokes where it's, but it balances something else in a different part. Composition.
Yeah.
You see your work and your life as a composition, which, you know, can make sense too.
Right.
So I'm just interested in how you see that.
Well, these are really very deep, I mean, we're in deep areas here. One of the things that I've been thinking about, because I have this film called Mnemosyne, Mother of Muses, which is, Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, and thinking a lot about memory, and
it's also circular.
So a couple of things. One, I've just been thinking about it more. I wrote something, revised something in the book, like of all the things, I mean there's hundreds of things that I would love to read or reread. It's never going to happen. But some things, like what I'm doing now is reading Proust again, because he was somebody that was really important. Now, there was something that struck me, is the title of his book, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time. It's translated as Remembrance of Things Past, which is really stupid. It's just a kind of stupid mistranslation, because Remembrance of Things Past is like, oh yeah, I remember when I was in high school and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Whereas In Search of Time Past is something more profound. So that sense of, but what I'm struggling with a little bit is I was feeling that a lot of those people that were, I mean, I had different relationships with the people who were filmmakers in that generation. And so those people like Brakhage or Paul Sharits, or you know, they were larger than life, and so they were like media stars also. Like, and I felt in the beginning a certain kind of inhibition that here I was, you know, with a PhD in comparative literature, how embarrassing that was. Now, it shouldn't be, and now
No,
I'm
it
not.
shouldn't, Larry, that's not, I was very impressed when
Yeah,
I
but
found
felt-
out a
But in my
filmmaker.
own feelings, I felt that I didn't quite belong, that they had a certain kind of powerful, magnetic personalities, and they had come somehow through a kind of art education. Like when I started making films, I felt like I really wish I had been a painter rather than music or whatever.
You didn't
So-
have the right pedigree.
Yes, right. So I know that that's stupid, and I no longer feel like that,
It's not
but I did feel
stupid,
like
it's
that.
true.
Now, the question is, even with the book, or do I want to rise up and say, wait a minute, my life is really important. You should really get into my life. Because I don't want that to be in any way part of the experience. I mean, to me, it's kind of fascinating how things in life, like in other words, let's say I went to Pittsburgh and I went with the camp with this tape recorder, but in the book I just did this, in the book I have these sort of italicized little comments that occur. Sometimes they're quotations, sometimes they're just quotations from the text that just recently appeared. So I was writing about that thing of the sound of the hangers sliding. And I said it in the way that I sort of said it here, but then I put it in italicized, the sound, the hangers sliding. Something like that stood out as had, but some of the things which I didn't talk about, I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be that if I tell you some things about what led me to do the things that I did, that's something about the process of creation, or about cinema, or about, in other words, it's not about me, it's using myself as a, as material
Sure.
for something. And of course, it's an issue that I'm facing now, and I don't know how it will come out, about whether, because what I thought is that thinking of all my work as one project, and the book as the crowning thing, and the book is what makes the films one thing. So then, is it now over? In other words, is the book my last creative work, or am I going to do something else? But what I feel is that the pressure on whatever else I would do is really severe. In other words, so I see things all the time, like, oh, if I don't do it at all. I don't even know how the thing works on my cell phone. I once did a little bit. But, you know, all the time I see things, oh, take that. I don't feel that assembling a lot of interesting shots is what needs to happen now. I need to have something with more resonance, and I don't know what that is. But I'm thinking one element is to bring something into the contemporary situation that we're in. Yeah.
I have a question about, like, what you say is your complete body of work, because I've been investigating the Co-op's collection of 8mm and Super 8, and a lot of these small gauge films are not included in a lot of filmmakers' catalog raisonné. And I remember Saul Levine has a lot of Super 8.
Yeah.
There, Luis Ernesto Arocha, no one knew, no one's seen his 8mm films. So I think access to camera also kind of dictates what kind of filmmaker you're going to be. If you have access to a digital camera,
Yeah.
like I remember Viet Flake's Carol Lee, you could see her hand,
Right.
she's using a magnifying glass, she's borrowing a camera, and now that becomes part of her aesthetics.
Yeah. I have a big problem now. I mean, things are not as I wish they would be. So I have a whole bunch of, I made a lot of stuff in 8mm.
I figured you did.
I
I'd
used
love
one
to
thing in Four Shadows, the thing of the surveyors was done, and Blues actually was made 8mm, blown up to 16mm. But I have these, like a box with all these like 8mm films, and I remember certain things, and I'm thinking if I could go through it. The projector doesn't work, I don't have a way of doing it. I have rolls of 100-foot rolls of 16mm. My projector doesn't work. I have,
Don't project them, you'll scratch them.
yeah,
But Black Magic has made a scanner for 8mm and Super 8. Actually, Ian just wrote a grant to NISCA, and they turned us down because they're going, it's 8mm, Super 8, but eventually we're going to do a fundraiser. And we're going to scan, because I think the aesthetics of 8mm and Super 8 are what the iPhone is like now. And you'll discover part of yourself that you hadn't seen or considered part of your
yeah. Also, there's some things that I made
catalog
earlier.
resin.
We were talking about my work, I don't know.
Can I say something?
Sure, of course.
There are a lot of parts, I'm trying to
Yeah, I guess.
kind of focus in on it. I had the good fortune and perspective of having been through the Binghamton program, having studied with you, having gone to Buffalo and studied with Hollis and Paul and Tony and Woody and Stana.
Right.
And I remember telling Ralph Hocking, or having a conversation with Ralph Hocking, and he said, I don't know anybody who's experienced what you experienced. And I said to him, I think it really fucked me up. Because it gave me an insight into the world of cinema and media that the world has not caught up with yet in 30 years. So one of the things when I see your work, I'm such a fan of it, because I think what you've accomplished is remarkable in what the relationship between the image in your mind is, or our mind as viewers, and the space that you create for us to be able to think is absolutely remarkable. And it's like one of the most human things, that it's like a space of cinema that is really part of what cinema can really do. Now, I've taught in an art school, having just retired from it, for 33 years. So I had a lot of experience with Viz Arts. And that whole world that is about things being graphic, things being visual, things being, as Hollis said, cinema, he said cinema is ahead of the art world by some 20 years. And he was being provocative. But he was right, and he said it was partially because the cinema could work with all codes, photographic codes, painterly codes, language codes, poetry codes, musical codes, everything, anything. It was the multidisciplinary form, and it really is a matter of time and history for it to play out, or artists to be able to play in that space. Meanwhile, the form that we're in has sort of been, I'm fishing for a word, I can't find it. It's not that it's been stolen, but it's sort of the danger of becoming culturally popular. It's become a monster in terms of sort of what media is. But the thing that's surprising is that sometimes I really wonder if it's actually going to take 20 years, or maybe it's going to take 50 years. Because it is like how long it takes for the culture to sort of be done with some sort of directions, and also to evaluate what its history is and what that literature, what that phenomena is. And I just think, again, coming back to your work, every time I recently got your Horizons DVD from Renoir in New York, or in Paris. And I can't tell you how thrilled I was to see the work again. And I thought a little different than you're describing. I thought blues and, is it corn
Yeah.
and doorway, and there is vital to me now, and to me, they're more political
Yeah.
than a lot of things that call themselves political.
I was so thrilled, I gotta tell you, sorry.
So anyway, I could go on and on, but I just think it's, what you're presenting is so really important, and I don't think it's Larry talking about his films and he's recollecting about his films. No, I think, in your book, in fact, I think it's one of the most, I was so excited to read it. I have a huge library, I have a lot of, it's not that I'm short on stuff to read. I couldn't believe what you pulled off in what you wrote, and I read it again to make sure I wasn't wrong. And so I think that text actually is going to, that text may be part of a way for people to learn, not just to see your films, but to actually see visual work.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of where we're at, and I feel, not that I feel partially guilty, because I felt I was in an art school, I was fighting the good fight for time-based work, no question about it. But I think, if I were to be just blunt, I would just say, most of the criticism analysis I saw in that world, art school world, was like the sun in how the shadow happens, in that kind of stilted, well-intended,
Right.
but really just please come up,
Yeah.
grow up, you know. And
I have to tell you that I thought of you, it's like amazing because there's so much of a period in what they're saying, especially when she talks about a television machine.
oh, yeah,
I love that word, and how to her, like, I don't know, this is probably made at the end of World War II or right after that. And so these things like television and radar and whatever, all those things were concepts that everybody should have been thinking about what's going on here. But you were actually somebody who was able to be in that transitional thing of film and video and electronic, whatever. So, that's really interesting. By the way, Hollis was somebody that
Right.
later he was thinking of this giant, I forget what it's called, the Straits of Magellan,
yeah, it's very
where a lot of his work would be part of one project. And actually his work, and I suppose of the filmmakers, I mean, I love especially like Tony Conrad's stuff, but I mean, Hollis was somebody that I was sort of closer to and feel that sort of kinship with. I mean, he had a different way, his writing is very different, and he had certain things really very.
Hey Larry, what about next year? You talk about Hollis Frampton. We show some Hollis Frampton films, and you can select something of yours. What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's tough.
Well,
I mean, it's.
because you're traveling, or
No, I mean, it's just to think about his films in a way that I could articulate it. I mean, certainly Zorn's Lemma is a very important film, and also this is an interesting just anecdote, is that, he was coming to visit in Binghamton in a period of time where there were these melodramatic events that happened that meant that he couldn't be teaching in Binghamton, and he had gotten a place in upstate New York because of Bob Hewitt, who was his friend and colleague at Hunter College. So he was already upstate, and so that's how the whole Buffalo thing was happening. But I'll think of it in a while.
do you want to take a break and we'll go outside? You can have a glass of water.
Sure, I mean, whatever you want to do, I'm here for. I mean, this is a very special occasion.
Yes, let's give a round of applause. And
I don't know what to do with that stupid sound. It's really, I hope it's not on there. I mean, because it's in the silent sections that you hear it, it's easy to kind of just delete it.
Can I ask a quick question? I don't want to hold anyone up, but I was just curious, I appreciate and agree with the description of your films as operating this way, where they're sort of cultivating meaning less so than a space where your audience is free to sort of associate and stage inquiries. I had an experience which resonated a lot with what you've been talking about, but one thing that struck me as being sort of oblique was you briefly mentioned suicide, and I was just curious if you could elaborate a bit on how you think that concept is functioning in this particular work, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing.
Well, it's very important. It gets into things that are really deeply embedded into my life in such a way that I don't know how to deal with it. One thing was about my grandmother, and when I was a kid, who, I don't want to go into the whole story, but she jumped off the roof of her building and killed herself. And at the same age, that's when I was like 12 years old, and at the same age, Debbie had found her mother hanging in the garage, and that was one of the many bonds that we had. I mean, this is stupid, but I mean, there are these different, I don't want to be in the same position as like Brakhage and Jane, you know, where, you know, he was always saying, my films are really by Brakhage and Jane, and then he left her. Evidently, there's she's written some books about her life that's really important. But anyway, this whole thing about my relationship with her and her with me had those kind of bonds in it. So that the progression of the thing about the family is, and the breakdown of the family and the ensuing things is all part of my own life, but it's not necessarily belong in the films, but it's that kind of emotional pressure in the films. I mean, of course, that's much more severe than paranoia. I mean, it's, and also it connects, if you want to go in further, because I've been thinking about it, but I don't know the answer at all, about the tree of life. I mean, there's very little you could find out about the tree of life. Supposedly, in fact, one interpretation of the fall is that God didn't want them, now that they showed themselves as easily manipulated. If they ate from the tree of life, then they would be immortal. And that would piss him off, whatever. So I don't even know if that's an interpretation. I mean, but death. So that by being expelled from the Garden of Eden, not only was it leading to sort of sexual procreation of the world, but also death was part of it. Now you never read about this stuff. I mean, so it's just my own imagination from hearing those stories. But death is...
I'm against it. I'm for vampires.
all right, so, well,
I do have something to say, a brief question. It's not even really, I don't think it's necessarily well thought out, but I just wanted to say, first of all, that I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us today, Larry, and to present these thoughts with us. The book that's coming out, I mean, I feel like it should have as much of an impact on cinema as Brackage's Metaphors of Vision, if I could put you in the same camp with him and not be uncomfortable with that. I love the movement of the film. I love how much you think about the form of narrative, and I'm really, I love the moments of ellipsis, the moments of the breaks, those silence moments, and how ellipsis and the elliptical movement, circularity of the film, how much of that, I guess, I'm relating to other writers in the 70s. I'm thinking of French writers in the Roman Nouveau of Rob Goulet and Duras that kind of employed this elliptical sense of narrative to kind of bring out an alternative form of knowledge that is more open and open access to knowledge, I guess. And I think that the way you present it is very open, against opening space for thought. But I guess do you have a comment on that, on the use of ellipsis, I guess, in your work, this moment of pausing?
Well, it's very important. I don't know if I can, I mean, it starts in Mouche Volante, the first sound film in this series of electrophonies, but it's really present a lot in Not Not, where black lead, I mean, again, it was by accident, because I had used black leader and abrupt pauses and black in this film, Chants and Dances for Him, the film, the Haiti film, voodoo film. And I had this idea of getting some black leader. So I went and got some old rolls of film, got the black leader, and the black leader, even here you could see that it had like some sparkly holes in it that had the emotion just kind of flakes off. So I decided to use that as a major element in the film.
I love you dearly, Larry. Let's give Larry a round of applause.
But I couldn't, the thing that you gave me, which I couldn't, that the most irreplaceable thing you gave me is the attention to the film. So nothing could approach that. That's it.